I'm Chris from the Brain Health Daily, and in this video I'll be showing you the neuroscience behind your anxiety and a few ways in which you can reduce these levels of anxiety using a few techniques that I'm going to give you towards the end of the video. Within this video I'm going to be referencing one of my favorite books on neuroscience. It's written by Richard Davidson. Neuroscience is from the US, who has conducted many experiments and done a lot of research within the field of affective neuroscience, which is the neuroscience behind your emotions. So I'm going to take a lesson that I've learned out of that book and apply it to the board, and just so I can explain to you the mechanisms behind your anxiety and ways in which that you can use these mechanisms to your advantage so that you can reduce your levels of anxiety. So first off, we have the brain. It's not a very good drawing of the brain, but that doesn't matter. So we have here a thing called the prefrontal cortex, PFC. And the prefrontal cortex is where we do a lot of our logical, rational thinking. We make a lot of decisions, a lot of planning for things in the future. So it's really a thinking part of the brain. Now, if we go down here to about there, in the middle of the brain we have what we call the limbic system. And within the limbic system we have a part of the brain called the amygdala. So the amygdala is there, and it's usually really small. The amygdala is responsible for setting off the alarms, the fight or flight part of the brain. It usually, if we experience fear, it's the amygdala that's highly activated, and this is responsible for that fight or flight response. What some of the results have shown in the studies that are done within this book, The Emotional Life of Your Brain by Richard Davidson, was that after doing scans they found that people who experienced more positive emotion and were quicker to bounce back from adversity and emotional pain, they had higher activation in their left prefrontal cortex. Whereas people who were slower to bounce back from adversity, people who are more emotional and uninhibited with their fear response, they had higher activation in their right prefrontal cortex. As the years went on and neurotechnology got a little bit better, the MRI studies started to come onto the scene, and Richard Davidson found that there was another element to people who suffered from high levels of anxiety or just negative emotion in general. It could be depression, sadness, grief, people who felt those emotions more. But they also found that the connections between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala of people who were susceptible to anxiety, they were weak. And so if we look at the mechanics behind it, earlier I mentioned that the prefrontal cortex is responsible for rational, logical thought, as opposed to the amygdala, which is just it's purely emotion. It's fight or flight, anxiety, fear. So you could imagine if the rational part of your brain isn't able to respond properly with the emotional part of your brain, then negative emotions like fear, depression are going to linger for much longer than if the connections were stronger. Now, to break it down, these connections, we have brain cells called neurons. So I'm just going to attempt to draw a neuron here. It's not going to be that great. That's a neuron. We have 100 billion of these in our whole nervous system. And what happens is they receive electrical impulses, and these electrical impulses run down this highway called an axon, and then down here where they release neurochemicals to the next neuron. Now, the researchers found that the white matter between the PFC and the amygdala of people who experience high levels of anxiety, they were weak. So this part of the neuron is grey matter. This part of the neuron, the axon, is white matter. So we have neurons, we have billions of neurons in the prefrontal cortex, and these connect to the amygdala via the axons. So the rational part of the brain and the emotional part of the brain must communicate. They do so with axons. Grey matter is where these part of the axon, where these part of the neurons are, and white matter is characterized by the axon. Why is increasing the connectivity important though? To put it simply, the rational part of your brain sends inhibitory signals to your amygdala. So the rational part of the brain needs to step in with its logic and with its reason and send signals that inhibit the activation of this amygdala. And if it can achieve that, it can reduce your levels of anxiety as a result. Now, just because you may experience high levels of anxiety and it may suggest that you do have faulty connections between your rational part of the brain and the emotional part of the brain, the amygdala, it doesn't mean that you're doomed to suffer from anxiety, because other researchers found, and I'm going to share these tips now, that other researchers found that not only can you shrink the amygdala and make it less active, but you can also increase connectivity between this amygdala, this emotional part of the brain, and the rational part of your brain, the prefrontal cortex. So I'm going to give you 3 strategies, and one of them is CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. Now, there has been a study, and I will put the references in the comment section of this video, but there has been a study that has shown that people who engage in CBT exercises can actually increase connectivity between this rational part of the brain and the amygdala. When the rational part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, is able to send more signals, inhibitory signals, down to your amygdala, this is going to significantly reduce your levels of anxiety. The second technique is mindfulness meditation. In a study, it was found that mindfulness not only increases the connectivity between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala, but it can also shrink the amygdala. And you could assume that the shrinkage of this alarm system is going to reduce your levels of anxiety. Now, you still want your alarm system. You still want your fight or flight response. There's danger. We need the amygdala to look after, our physical body. We need the amygdala to protect us from danger. But when it's overactive, it's usually found to be overactive in people who suffer from chronic anxiety, anxiety disorders, social anxiety, all these kinds of things. So you don't want to completely shut it off. But if you're susceptible to anxiety, then shrinking it a little bit and decreasing that activation, the activity in the amygdala, is going to help with your levels of anxiety. The final technique is EFT, or emotional freedom technique. There have been scans done, multiple studies done with people who engaged in emotional freedom technique, and the brain scans pretty much found that after a session of EFT, or emotional freedom technique, 30 minutes I think it was, in this particular study that I found, the activation of the amygdala was significantly decreased. So you know, if you look at it and you say, okay, I may have weak connections here between my rational part of the brain and my emotional part of the brain. Whenever I want to take control of that, I can either use CBT and mindfulness to build new connections between the prefrontal cortex, so your rational mind can jump in quicker and inhibit some of those emotional responses that are unfavorable. Or you can use EFT and just go straight to the source and tap into that amygdala using the EFT techniques. I have a lot of videos up about emotional freedom techniques, so if you want to find out more about that, go and look up some of my videos on that. I aggregated a lot of studies into that video. And yeah, that video pretty much explained how by reducing the activation of the amygdala, people were able to significantly reduce levels of cortisol, the stress hormone, which was used as a biomarker in people's saliva to measure just how much people's anxiety decreased after applying the technique. So to wrap it up, CBT, mindfulness, EFT to reduce your levels of anxiety. I hope you enjoy this video.